Okay, welcome everyone to Gurdjieff Unveiled. This is our fourth session. We are still on the chapter 3, or lesson 3 in the book. And so today I'm going to turn this over to Sy and Harry.
All right. Well, what I'd like to suggest then, and it's actually in the text, is that we attempt a second experiment in attention while we're together in this group. And what the text suggests, which is probably good as anything else, is try to have a sensation of your left leg while we're conversing. So just give it a try and see to what extent you're able to hold that in the attention as we proceed. I had asked the co-facilitators if I might take a few minutes to sort of recapitulate where we are in terms of these ideas as expressed in this text, Gurdjieff Unveiled. Actually, we're about halfway through the text, in the sense that the first 4 lessons or chapters are the substance, whereas lesson number 5 about meditation and number 6 is a variety of different things related to the Gurdjieff's work, but is not actually part of what we're trying to understand about the basic principles. So that's why I thought it's a good idea to simply recapitulate briefly. I'll mention a few things, and if anybody wants a comment, just jump in, please. You may recall that in the first lesson, which was called, the title was Who Am I? It was suggested that there are really 2 questions. John Bennett called them Gurdjieff's questions, but they appear for many, many people who are interested in ideas of this kind. The first question is exactly, who am I? And the second question is, what is the significance, if any, of this human life? So I'll just give a brief explanation of my understanding of the answers to these questions. Now, the answers are not easy. People have struggled with them for centuries, actually. But according to Gurdjieff, and I happen to agree with him based upon my experience, the answer to who am I is that I am, to use Gurdjieff's term, endlessness. Now, I could say God, but that gets pretty argumentative, and there are some other terms, soul. So Gurdjieff says, really, in effect, I am endlessness. The second question pertains to the first, and that is, what is the purpose of human life? And as far as I can understand it, the purpose of human life on this planet Earth, and we know of no other planets based on experience, at least I don't, is that the purpose is to become conscious of who I am, or who am I. And this is done through this work. In other words, this is really the purpose of this human life. You could think of a lot of subsidiary purposes. I want to be happy. I want to make money. I want to have children. I want to enjoy my grandchildren, for example. But the real answer, at least as I understand it, is to become conscious of who I am, and that is the purpose of human life. Whereas other forms, as far as we know, I know there's some questions about dolphins and some other life forms, but in general, it's human life that has the ability to be conscious of who it is. Continuing onward from the first session, you may recall that this is called the fourth way. Spensky actually gave it that definition, but he was quoting Gurdjieff. And Gurdjieff pointed out that in every tradition, call it a religious tradition or any kind of tradition, if you like, there have been three traditional ways of functioning. What are the ways? Gurdjieff says the ways are the ways to immortality. Now that's a big statement because most people want to be immortal, but we take it incorrectly as being the immortality of the personality. Whereas if we think about it a little bit, we realize that there are no immortal personalities. So people for centuries in humanity who have been interested in this question have tried to find some way to disidentify from the personality, which arguably is not immortal and cannot be, and move our identification to what Gurdjieff calls essence. You could call it soul if you like, or endlessness, which is immortal. That is, it was never born and never dies. So the traditional way have focused on tremendous efforts made by people, and it's always a small portion of the population doing tremendous physical efforts. We call it hatha yoga. Maybe things like standing on one foot for 6 hours. That's called, Gurdjieff calls that the way of the fakir. A second way, he says, is the emotional way, the way of the monk who may spend all day in his little cell praying, in some way hoping to get out of the personality. And the third way is he called the way of the yogi, or the intellectual way, which would be, again, a very demanding intellectual way, like memorizing, for example, the list of 10,000 angels, things like that. So Gurdjieff comes along and says, well, these are the traditional ways. People still do them, although a pretty small population. However, and it's more and more difficult as humanity becomes more urbanized, but it is the fourth way that this immortality of essence can be experienced or attained by balancing all of these three different ways. Whichever way we're most inclined to is the way that needs to be balanced against the ways which we're not inclined to. And so he called this the fourth way, and he also called it a way in life. You don't have to go to a monastery to do this. You can function in everyday life. And how do you do it? You do it by what Gurdjieff called the work, capital W, I like to think of. And that work is the intentional effort to move out of identification with the personality and into identification with that which is immortal. Now, what's important about this is that there's only one tool that we really have to do this, and it is our attention. And we have to discover that this is true, that it is the only tool. And by gaining control of the attention rather than allowing the attention to be taken, which it usually is how we do it. And it's a very long process for most people. If you're listening to Sy right now, looking at him, he is taking your attention. So you need to do something to break that. And Gurdjieff suggests the simplest way is to go to the physical body and put your attention on part or all of it, like the left leg, which chances are we've already forgotten to try in these few minutes that I've been talking. So come back to it. Do it again and again and again. And what this is connected to is the refinement of energy. These machines in which we live, Gurdjieff called them chemical factories, which or he also called them machines, which have the purpose of refining the energy that comes into the organism, like energy in a potato that we might eat. Energy can be extracted from that, and the machine does it automatically for the purpose of its own existence. We call it digestion, so that we have energy to move our arms and legs. But there are finer and finer degrees of energy. Sexual energy is a good example, of very powerful energy. And we need to accumulate finer energies within the organism if we are going to be able to move our identity from the personality to essence. And so that was really the purpose of the second lesson in the book, was talking about this one tool, and that's our attention. And that really brings us, for the most part, to where we are now, which is the third lesson, which has to do with the transmutation of energy, or another way to say it is the refining of energy, so that we have sufficient energy of the appropriate kind in order to get out of identification with our personality. And when we get into the fourth lesson, which most practical Gurdjieff work is about, is blocking the leaks of energy. And those leaks are our identification with various emotions, usually negative emotions. So that's a real brief summary. It's probably too long, but at least as I understand the work, that's what it's about. And I'll simply stop here before we go on and turn it over to Harry.
Okay, I'll continue on. Pretty soon, we'll be talking about other subjects in the work, the basis of which we need to understand these subjects is the vibrations. So I just want to briefly talk about vibrations in the work and the importance of it to understanding topics that will be coming up in the near future. Everything we see, the air, material things, ourselves, the water, everything vibrates. There's a vibration to it. We see this in the molecules and atoms. Everything vibrates. It never stops moving. And if you take the whole ray of spectrum from one end of the light spectrum to the other end, and also to the X-rays and the gamma rays, infrared rays, and everything, our whole life, everything we see in life and know and understand, even to our physics, is just a very narrow portion of that spectrum. It's very narrow. And as we're discovering that there are other levels beyond our spectrum in which there are more vibrations and maybe even different universes occupying a different vibratory rate. We just have no access to it. We cannot understand it, how it works, but everything vibrates. Now, when you talk about vibration, there's a way to understand that and to work with it by studying the musical scale, which we call the octavic scale, which means consisting of 8 notes. Most of you are familiar with the musical scale. But in that scale, there are 2 areas. If you go from Do to Re and Mi, it's usually the same, pretty much the same. You divide it in half and so forth. But you get to a certain point, like between Mi and Fa, something happens, and there's a little disruption. It's like an inconsistency. And nobody can understand that. But it's called the Mayflower Interval. And it occurs again between C and Do. We call C the last note, which in Latin I think is called T, but we refer to it as C. So between C and the next octave, which is Do again, there's another disruption, and we call these areas shocks and shock intervals. And we'll become more familiar with how that works later on. But everything has, you can study the whole universe by studying the octaves and how it works in conjunction with the law of 3 and 7. This is very important to the octave, and also to understand the process of how things are formed and how they are created. And you'll understand the evolutionary aspect of an octave and the involutionary aspect of the octave. Now, the same laws that exist, also one more thing, the same laws that exist in the universe exist in here. The same law of creation that exists in the universe exists in here. That's because all the octaves are the same. And it's called the law of conformity. So if you want to understand the universe and another person, look inside to yourself, because you have the universe inside you. It works the same way as nature and beyond. So I just wanted to bring that up before we got into the transmutation of energy. We experimented with eating earlier, taking in food. Well, that process is a transmutation of energy. We are breaking down the food particles as food for the body to help build the body. And in that process, the material that is not used goes to waste. It goes back into nature. This is a form of transmutation of energy. Now, in our daily life, for example, and this is a good example, most of us walk around in the daytime, not aware of ourselves. Our attention is not on anything in particular. We're daydreaming, but there's all kinds of activity going on around us that is influencing us, and we're not aware of it unless something hits us over the head and we say, "What's that?" And what this is it's that energy that's going on around you is active in a way, and you are totally what we call passive. In other words, you're the resistance, but you want to overcome that. But when you apply your attention to what's going on around you, you're giving attention to the active aspect of life, what's going on around you, and you are taking some of that energy from that into yourself. And then you become active, and the events going on around you become passive. You're turning the active into passive. You're turning yourself passive into active. And what is the neutralizing or the reconciling force of all this? It's the work. And so this is how we can work on ourselves, by turning the active force that's affecting you into passive, making you active, making yourself in charge. And the reconciling force is your wish, your desire. It is to work on yourself. It's the work. So this is a way how we can transmute that energy, that situation, to your advantage, for your being, to work on your being, to make your being grow. And in a sense, this is a type of food as well. These are impressions that are coming in or coming at you, as well as negativity. All that is coming at you. You want to take an active role and put your attention on it and make a change. So that becomes passive, and you're in charge. You become active. And again, the reconciling force is the work.
You want to give a personal example of that, Harry, so that you can, as you work it out?
Well, if I'm in a car, for example, which I'm listening to the radio most of the time, and when I'm driving, the body knows how to drive a car without your attention. I think we all know that. So we daydream a lot in the car. We miss an intersection. We miss a turn. We're going the wrong way. We've gone way beyond our destination. Things like that. And there may be an accident up ahead, and all of a sudden it takes your attention. So the thing to do is first to realize what's going on by applying your attention to the situation. And you can make the correction. You can turn that event into something positive for your body, for your self-being, by becoming active. Either stop and wait for the situation to change, or to turn around and go back, to redirect yourself, or to make an effort, a super effort, to stop at the nearest gas station and fill up with gas. You're changing that active point in your life, which is disrupting you. You're changing into passive, and you are becoming active. You're in charge. You are correcting the situation. And you can do this by applying your attention. And not only that, but dividing it by remembering yourself, by self-observation, and using the work as the reconciling force, remembering how to work on yourself. You'll see this a lot in the work. It'll become the basis of the work eventually, as we get into it, when we talk about other things. Before I go on, go ahead.
No, what you're describing, Harry, Gurdjieff calls them the two great laws of world creation and world maintenance. And even the diagram on the screen represents one of those two great laws. In this case, it's the law of the three forces. And you can see the triangle there with the affirming, denying, and neutralizing force. In effect, it's artificial. The second great law Harry talked about is called the law of the octave, which has points in the changing of vibrations which are not uniform. That is, there's a distortion. If you take something, let's say 0 to 100, and divide it into units of 10, then you could have 10 equal levels of varying vibrations, more and more rapid vibrations. But something is intentionally inserted into the scheme of things, into the vibrations, which is intentionally disruptive. And that's the place in the octaves that Harry mentioned that we see as the intervals on the piano keyboard between E and F and between B and C. Now, there's another problem here. As I understand it, Gurdjieff says none of this is real. That is, it's not the real world. The only real world is endlessness, the unity, the oneness. And the way I like to think about it is like this. See my two hands there together? That's oneness. Now, that's all there is. There's nothing else. But for the purpose of becoming conscious that we are endlessness, you could say that the universe was put into existence. And in the human form developed on planet Earth, we have the possibility of understanding this. The problem is this. In order to understand this, I need to divide oneness by self-observation into affirming and denying. Affirming, denying. But that's artificial, and furthermore, because it's artificial, always back to one. It's always back to unity. Now the problem, and this has to do with the question of time, which is a big question, not just in the Gurdjieff work, but in other works, is that there's no time. So if I artificially divide 1 into 2 or 3, always back to 1, always back to 1, always back to 1, there's no time for experience. Therefore, this other law, the law of the discontinuity of vibrations, it was inserted, I guess, by endlessness for the purpose of allowing us the time for experience. And as I understand it, that's the reason for the other law, which Gurdjieff calls the law of the active, and he has other names for it. I'll say over.
Okay.
I wanted to say something real quickly. To put this real simply, because I'm a psychotherapist, when I see myself reacting to something, that is a denying force. If I'm reacting rather than responding and going into my body and going into my inner world, that's a denying force. My affirming is within me. So I have to use the work in my self-observation as the neutralizing force. So I'm just trying to see how, show you all how I would use it in my work.
When we talk about neutralizing force, denying force, affirming force, or active, passive, and negative, the forces are not different. The energy, the force is all the same. One is not active all the time, one is not neutralized all the time, and one is not denied. The same kind of events, they can alternate into different, where they dominate and change, and it's the theory of where there's in every action has to be a reaction, and it doesn't matter what kind of action it is, where it comes from. It's not necessarily negative or passive or neutralizing. All energy is the same. This just helps put everything into a relationship relative to one another. And also, you'll see, I talked about the C-Do interval, which is further up on the circle, as we will discuss with the Enneagram. But in the construction of the Enneagram, that interval is located in the area where you see it's affirming force, which usually in the Enneagram, it's the reconciling force. But that's just how the Enneagram works. You'll see as time goes on why it's in that position and not further up. So, as you can see, there is discontinuity in perfection of the universe. The universe is not perfect. There are discontinuities and inconsistencies, and this helps us to look at the universe and our life more accurately and to work with it. I'll be talking about the Five Strivings. The Five Strivings is something that comes directly from Gurdjieff's book. And I think at this point we haven't really discussed anything directly from Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. But in that book, there's a section called the Five Being Obligolnian Strivings. Now, in this book, he uses very strange words. A lot of them have parts of it belonging to Armenian, another part Turkish, another part Greek, and another part English. But these are words that are constructed in such a way so that these words actually mean something. And if you look into the definition of these words broken up, you can actually see their origin and what they mean. Now, everything that Gurdjieff writes about in Beelzebubs can be taken on many, many different levels. There's no one strong definition about anything he writes about. He makes a very strong super effort to make the book difficult to read and to understand. And he does that for a purpose, to make us work and struggle to understand what's in the book. In the book, he has 5 being Obligolnian strivings. Obligolnian means, to look at it, well, it means like obligation. So that could be that comes to your mind. And in fact, that in essence just so happens to mean obligation. But what does it mean by being Obligolnian or being striving, or being obligated for your being. So these are being Obligolnian. These strivings are for your being, to help your being grow. And of course, there are 5 of them. The first one is to have in the ordinary being existence. And this isn't necessarily ordinary existence for our ordinary life. It's being existence, the existence for being. Everything satisfying and really necessary for their planetary body. Does anybody have any thoughts about what that might mean to have everything satisfying?
I'm just going to, I think that is our survival. That's our lower centers. That's our animal centers. We have to at all times take charge of our survival needs, take care of ourselves. And oftentimes, as a psychotherapist, I look to how we were taught to take care of ourselves. So we're constantly looking at taking care of just our survival needs in that first striving, which is ongoing every day, every moment, taking care of the lower centers. So that's my input on that one.
Okay. Well, it can also mean to have a state of readiness for our planetary body, for use of intelligence, such as acting, drama, in the sense of wholeness. To have something satisfying for our being existence, for our planetary body. We want to put ourselves under the influences in preparation for experiences that can help make these parts of our body to grow and to work properly, and essentially that involves the lower centers. The first striving is easily accomplished by most of us, so we wouldn't have the time, resources, or inclination to pursue the work in the first place. And the next sentence is rather strange. I'm referring to a paper you don't have. Failure in this area will immediately disqualify anyone from membership in a group. That doesn't mean that if you don't do this exercise, you're out the door. It doesn't mean anything like that. It's something you have to do, or else your being won't grow. You become stagnant. The second striving, to have a constant and unflagging instinctive need for self-perfection in the sense of being. And what is it that we think we need for self-perfection? What is it we want that can help us to perfect ourselves and our sense of being? Are there any thoughts on that?
We have to pay attention to instinctive. We have to have the instinctive, our instincts, our gut instinct is to perfect our bodies and to have a sense that we desire. It comes from the desire level. So those of you who study the stanzas and the Ashish group and different things like that, or just have in astrology, I look at the basic desire and motivations of the individual. You have to pay attention to your instincts, and that instinct has to desire for well-being, for a consciousness of well-being. So that desire can show up in many ways. The desire to do the work. That in itself is an instinctive need.
It becomes instinctive because of your wish and your desire to look for the unusual that can help you. And it becomes automatic. It becomes instinctive. And then when something happens or you come across something, it raises your senses, right, something's going on here. I think I'll look at this a little bit more closely. Curiosity, which is being more, knowing more, doing more. These are 3 main possibilities for human development in the way of being. And that's pretty much what that means. Now, the third striving, this is one of my favorite ones, the conscious striving to know ever more and more concerning the laws of world creation and world maintenance. It's a little bit different from the first two. Now, it mentions a conscious striving. That can be taken many ways. In other words, you're really making an effort consciously with your attention, perhaps self-observation, self-remembering, to know more and more about life, how it's created, and how it's maintained. These are all questions that we have. What does life mean? And it's the development, further development of the centers, the intellectual center. You have the desire. You want a genuine desire to understand the theories and processes of our universe and self-development. It goes into the axiom "as above, so below," which comes from, I think, Hermes Trismegistus, an ancient book. But essentially, it's as above, so below. It's saying that the same laws are working in the universe, work in your body. You want to know the universe, know the body. And it's as time goes on, and if you remain in the work, it'd be very, very advantageous for you to study the anatomy of the body. Just a basic understanding. You don't have to go into a college level educational books to really understand it. There are a lot of good books out there about the anatomy. To know how digestion works, for example, things like that, how the breathing works, how circulation works. And it can be very, very interesting and very fun to learn. And I would seriously recommend it for anybody who is weak in that area. Okay, the fourth striving. The striving from the beginning of their existence to pay for their arising and their individuality as quickly as possible, in order afterwards to be free, to lighten as much as possible the sorrow of our common Father. That's a big statement. Any thoughts on what that might mean? To pay for our existence, from the beginning of our existence, to pay for our rising. Who do we pay it to? And I'm my own individual. Am I indebted to anything higher? And why should I have to pay it as quickly as possible? It's a powerful statement. It's an important statement in the book. And how does this paying back, how does it help to lighten the sorrow of our common Father, of our endlessness? Call him God, whatever you wish to call him. Does anybody have any thoughts about that?
When you were talking about blessing your food, that's exactly a good example of what this means. That's perfect. So when you take on the role of blessing and being thankful, and in just an exercise, just like blessing the people that made your food, but that is taking on the sorrow. That's you taking on that issue. So you gave a great example of that.
We are very, very far down what is called the ray of creation. We'll be discussing this later. But on the beginning, on the upper level of the rays, because you have this endlessness, and you have galaxies, then you have our galaxy, and and then all the solar systems in our solar system, and we're on this little tiny pebble that, for all intents and purposes, is so small it doesn't actually exist in the universe. And it's incredible that we have the technology and knowledge to build a machine that can look back almost to the moment of what we call the Big Bang. So that's absolutely incredible. And so we are at the very, very far end of the universe. And we know that there's something out there called endlessness, the creator, God. And we want to return. We want to pay back. We want to be part of creation. And it's an extraordinary blessing, I guess you want to call it that. And it involves work. And I think, in some sense, God experiences His creation through us, through our senses, and we're helping Him to ease His sorrow, whatever sorrow that might be. Maybe the sorrow of not seeing His own creation or experiencing it, because He can only do that through us. And if we can do that, then we're easing His sorrow. There can be many different levels of understanding each of these strivings. The fifth striving, the striving always to assist the most rapid perfecting of other beings, both those similar to oneself and those of other forms, up to the degree of the sacred matvotai, that is, up to the degree of self-individuality. Sometimes Gurdjieff gives the definition of one of the words, strange words that he may use in his book. Now, the fifth striving may be one of the hardest, as it places us in the position of a teacher. Now, if we see somebody who has the same questions that we have in life and in our search, and we know quite a bit more than when we first started out, we can help our fellow man in this aspect by guiding him, maybe eventually showing him to a teacher or to your teacher. We want to aid in that and perfecting his being, because this will, in a sense, aid us, and it will help to ease the suffering of our all-common Father. As with every path of action, ego can represent the greatest obstacle. Ego is like a stick with two ends. The one end is arrogant, self-aggrandizing character, and the other is the meek, self-deprecating character. What they have in common is their focus on the egoic self. And we're talking about humility here. The humility balances the two and is the only place where selfless action can occur. Most of those who avoid the responsibility to teach, our fellow man, to help him raise his level of degree of self-individuality, we don't think we're ready, and that our ego can stand in the way. But do not estimate your capabilities, and do not be afraid to make a few mistakes. Teaching is the best way to learn.
Thank you so much, Harry. Sy, do you want to start with define the consciousness related to the above, this relativity as a larger scale that's in your book?
Okay. There's two things I wanted to mention, three things really. Relativity has to do with the idea that Harry mentioned, that the universe can be seen within us as well as out in the greater universe. In other words, the entire structure of endlessness is the same on different scales and in different times. So that's what relativity is. But the other thing I want to mention, because we're running out of time, take a good look at the Enneagram of Digestion. It's on page 39 of the book, and it tries to explain the transmutation of energy in these three different octaves that take place within us. The octave of physical food, the octave of air that we take in, and the active of impressions. Impressions are a very powerful source of energy. And try to remember that all of this is about the transmutation of energy so that we can generate a sufficiently high energy to be in touch with what Gurdjieff calls higher centers, which in fact means getting in touch with essence as opposed to personality. And there is an exercise that's given at the end of the chapter. It's called a stop in the doorway. And so during the week, to the extent we can remember it, try to make a stop when you go through the doorway. There's even a quote here from the Old Testament. And these words which I command you this day to be upon your heart, and you shall write them upon the door frames of your houses and on your gates. Now, this is really important. If anybody knows anything about Judaism, you may have seen this little metal or wooden box that Jews nail to the doorway of their house. And what it really is a reminder to make a stop. Just what we're talking about in these last 3 weeks. Make a stop. Expand your attention to include yourself in your attention. And this is the work, and this is the process of getting free of identification with the personality. The short answer is yes. As Harry mentioned earlier, the entire universe is a universe of vibrations. And all of these things, like the octave, are a way to measure vibrations.
I will be showing a different Enneagram, probably close to the time we're talking about the Enneagram of Digestion that's in the book. It'll be a little bit easier to understand because the one in the book is actually, I think, 3 Enneagrams superimposed on one another. So it's somewhat of an advanced presentation, but we will be using another Enneagram at the same time called the kitchen Enneagram. And this will show how the Enneagram works with the preparation of the food. And we can taking it to a different level later on. We can talk about the digestion of the different foods and so forth. It'll be breaking down the Enneagram that's in Sy's book so we can better understand it.
Gwen, any final remarks?
No, y'all done a great job. I want to thank you all for being here. This is kind of hard work, but we're trotting along here. So be sure and read the rest of the lesson number 3, because next week we'll have quite a few terms to use. But also remember to always use this in your own practical work. Always remember that this can be used in, rather than just use these terms, apply it to just practical terms. So thank you all for being here, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.